So again, I think we sort of talked about this. So big thing here is this whole business about setting priorities. It's fair enough for you to really, make sure your operating authority is making it clear what the priorities are, and then allows you to make your decisions that way. So just in summary, again, you're going to see that operational plan today. It actually, the risks within the operational plan, this isn't actually quite right. They actually have to be reviewed every year, and then the risk assessment has to be actually redone every 3 years. So that's the second bullet's went a little bit off the charts. It's a little bit incorrect. So this is where we would normally take a break, but you guys obviously aren't getting a break because we're on the fast track here, right? So unless you really feel you need one, you okay? Everyone okay? Okay. So this will give us time, I think, to spend a sufficient amount of time on these case studies. So the first one is Walkerton. Now, is anyone really familiar with Walkerton? Has any kind of connection with Walkerton? Because if there is anyone, if anyone thinks I'm being a little bit insensitive to the Walkerton situation, by all means, like raise it or whatever, right? Or if anyone's got any deeper knowledge, I'd certainly welcome that. I don't put myself out as being the final expert on what actually happened there. I do have some intelligence about it, but... So Walkerton, so that water tower is in Walkerton. That is a Saugeen River that had nothing really to do with the tragedy because they are actually on wells, they're not on surface water. But so what we had in Walkerton, we had this shallow well, it was actually well 5, that was heavily contaminated by bacteria from a neighboring farm. It was... yeah, so we'll talk about that. So we had about half the town that became very ill, gastroenteritis, mainly diarrhea, from a highly pathogenic form of E. coli and Campylobacter, as we kind of mentioned before. This diarrhea wasn't normal diarrhea. This was highly acidic diarrhea, and extremely painful and long-lasting. It was horrific, apparently, this diarrhea, and particularly that pathogenic form of E. coli. It produces something called a verotoxin. Now, verotoxins are among the most toxic elements known, and it's able to pass through the whatever you call that, the colon wall or the intestinal wall, into the bloodstream, and then attack especially kidneys, but also other internal organs as verotoxin. It was horrific, the effect of this. Oh, and by the way, both of these would have been killed if there was just sufficient chlorine in that drinking water supply, in that distribution system. So we had quite a number of people hospitalized. 27 have this hemolytic uremic syndrome. You don't get better from this, so they're still suffering from this if they haven't already passed. And 7 people died. There's also been a long-term healthcare study of Walkerton that was actually a really smart thing for the province to do at that time. So they introduced that, and what they found with that long-term healthcare study is that there's increased incidence compared to the provincial norms of a wide range of both mental and physical ailments being suffered by people in Walkerton. So the public inquiry, we know how to do public inquiries. You got to give the province credit on that. Justice O'Connor is like a saint in Walkerton. Maybe 1 or 2 people didn't like him, but fundamentally, people in Walkerton knew that Justice O'Connor was not there to cover anything up. He wanted to get at the truth, make recommendations to the province, and get those recommendations accepted. And of course, he did recommend a wide range of actions, all of which were accepted by consecutive governments, provincial governments. So in terms of events, we had, so again, heavy rains precipitated this. And after those rains, so this was the long weekend in May. After the long weekend, actually the staff had sent in a microbiological sample, theoretically from the distribution system, but apparently it was actually taken in the garage of the utility. But they did send it in, to give them credit. And the lab manager, so they sent it to a private lab. The lab sent the sample back to Stan Cable, faxed it back, saying that there was E. coli present in the sample, and called too to say, hey, did you see that you got E. coli in the sample? And then subsequently, the public health unit called, and they said to Stan, hey, we've got some health issues in town. We just want to make sure it's not from the drinking water. So what do you think Stan Cable said? It's not from the drinking water. The water's fine. Well, this is a difficult thing. So he'd already had that thing about the E. coli. He gets this lab call. He gets the call from public health. Some people are still saying, and I can understand this at one level, Stan was under the impression that the water's from the ground, and therefore it's always safe. Doesn't really matter what the lab says or anything else. It's from the ground. It's groundwater. Everyone knows that you can drink groundwater. Every farm around was drinking groundwater. He was drinking the water, apparently. So he just assumed that it was actually still okay, when of course it wasn't. And then of course we got the final. We actually started having people dying a little bit later. So this isn't really relevant. That's just the Saugeen River again. So this is where the net of the people responsible widens, though, because well 5 was approved and commissioned by the ministry. They did have a provision in the approval that the land above it would be protected, but of course that didn't actually happen because it wasn't actually like a requirement, a legal requirement. And despite the fact there had been some problems, the ministry didn't inspect those facilities for years. And of course, the chlorine disinfection piece is the crucial thing that wasn't being applied properly. So it was the operators, it was the provincial approvals and lack of inspections. Actually, when I was the ministry's regional director back in the period before Walkerton, the big focus of the ministry, and people might remember this, was on waste management. Like waste management was the big thing because water and sewage was considered considered to be well handled by the municipalities. They didn't really need strict, provincial oversight. But of course, everyone got woken up pretty fast with this. So this just shows the location of well 5, and that farm that's called the active farm. That's where the cattle were. So that's where the water flowed down to well 5, and just behind well 5, that little building with the parking lot, that was actually the works yard. So that's the garage, the infamous garage, where the operators were, and where apparently they took some of the samples that should have been out in the distribution system. Now this is the pattern of illness. Remember I showed you that really kind of stark one earlier where the pattern went up and down. So again, there had been reports in Walkerton that before this case, where we actually did have, again, E. coli in lab samples. So we think that there probably were unreported outbreaks there before this big unreported one. But so just on the chart, usually I can point these things out, but it's a bit hard from over here. So we think that the big storm occurred just on May the 12th. So we think that's when the initial contamination of well 5 occurred. Well 5 was definitely running at that time, and it's known to suck water from the surface down into the ground. they actually did a demonstration of that for me after they took well 5 out of service. They showed me, the operators that took over after the Walkerton tragedy showed me how it could suck water from the surface under, to the ground. Everyone knew it could do that. So on May the 13th, the next day, if the staff had gone out into the distribution system, took samples for a chlorine residual, that by the way is an analysis you can do on the spot, they would have seen no chlorine residual in a lot of those samples, right? So that was the first missed opportunity to do something, because they had other wells that they could have turned on, right? But they just kept running this with well 5. They did eventually switch it over to another well, but it was too late at that point. So, and then on May the 17th, so with May the 17th, there's again no detection of, there was, the chlorine residuals were 0 all the way through this period to May the 17th, and that's when the lab called Stan Cable and said, hey, you've got E. coli, you've got a positive E. coli. On May the 18th, you're starting to get this reports of gastroenteritis in the community. May the 19th, Stan Cable failed to advise the health unit of the micro results, even though he was called. Hey, we got illness in the town, how's the water? And then finally, on May the 21st, the health unit went ahead and put in the boil water advisory. The very next day, the first person died. This is bad, right? But you see what a lot of what's going on here is, well, there's two things: not doing your job, and then covering it up, right? But again, the belief systems of the people may have really got in the way here. And then you see we went back down to endemic levels after this tragedy, but probably not 0. The boil water advisory wasn't lifted for about 6 months, because one of the things that happened here was, since it was so horrific and people were so concerned that there'd be a reoccurrence, there was superchlorination of every building in the town. And you can imagine how complicated that was, like to get into the places, to get this, to do the superchlorination. One of my little jobs was, oh, Larry, we've emptied out like, I don't know, 1,000 water softeners. Can you get rid of the salt for us? This was one of the little things that came up, right? So everything, every hot water heater was drained and refilled, every water softener was dealt with, the whole plumbing system was superchlorinated. So it took 6 months before finally they lifted the boil water advisory. So source water protection, so the source was a fail. Well 5 was known to be contaminated. Treatment was a fail. They had one source of treatment, the provision of chlorine, and they were not consistently providing that. So that's 2 fails. That's the 2 big fails. Distribution, lots of issues in the distribution system. It hadn't been maintained and all the rest of it, but it wasn't really like the biggest issue. It didn't actually significantly contribute. And then monitoring. So monitoring failed. So if they've been taking those chlorine residuals, conscientiously, they would have found this way earlier, and they would have known that there was a problem. And then the samples being sent to the lab for microbiology were mislabeled. There was lots of issues there. Now the laboratory. Do you think the laboratory is at fault here for just reporting this to Stan Cable? I don't think they are. I actually don't think the laboratory is at fault. What actually happened there, like again, when I was back in the day, I was the regional director. Up above on the 2nd floor of the building, there was the provincial lab in London, and all these samples would have come into the provincial lab. That provincial lab, if there was a bad sample, what would happen is they would, first of all, they already are the ministry, so they'd let the abatement side of the ministry know that there was a bad sample, so the ministry gets advised. Public health gets advised. The owner gets advised. So everyone's in the loop, right? They close those provincial labs, and I'm not saying that was a bad decision, but what should have accompanied that was a requirement that if there is a bad sample, it gets reported to public health. And now, of course, that's all a requirement now, but it wasn't a requirement at the time. So if you're just running that lab, that private lab, and you get a bad sample, who are you going to report it to? Your client. There's no requirement to report it to anyone else. So that was a real gap that was left in the closing of the provincial lab. So again, that's another kind of knock on the province, I would say. And then on the management side, we had one of those situations here where we had council kind of having a bit of a buffer between them and the water utility or the operating authority by having a Public Utilities Commission. And of course, the Public Utilities Commission really, didn't have a lot of expertise. And of course, they ran both the water side and the electric side. And apparently Stan Cable was quite a capable linesman and spent most of his time on the electrical side. So the water was just kind of like an add-on. They really wanted to keep water rates low. And there had, again, been previous bad samples, but they weren't followed up. Again, there was falsified data, staff weren't properly trained, system wasn't being maintained, and of course the regulator could be said to have failed in their oversight. So the bottom line was this was failure at all levels. Complacency was a big issue here, as I mentioned earlier. They actually thought the water was always good. They thought that there was never been an illness in the town, even though there very likely was. Again, multiple factors. We'd had this well in this shallow well for a long time. And again, if there'd just been chlorine, and then just measured that chlorine, we may not have had this tragedy. So some significant costs related to this. And again, the human cost is, like extremely hard to measure, but huge. Definitely way more than running the system properly. Way more. Now, North Battleford, so this was, believe it or not, the very next year. The very next year. And we're talking about these two case studies. It was kind of interesting. You might, I don't know, this is a little anecdote, but my wife and I drove across Canada. We were delivering a car to my son that lived in BC at the time. And actually going to a wedding in Alberta at the same time. So it was kind of a fun trip, and we were coming along through Saskatchewan. I said, I want to go to North Battleford. I want to see North Battleford, because we're always talking about this, and I'd read the Inquirer report and all that. So we were driving into North Battleford. So the very first sign, of course, is Welcome to North Battleford. The very next sign was Boil Water Advisory in effect. So this was just a few years ago. So, clearly they're still having problems there at North Battleford with their water system, unfortunately. So what we had here, and you'll see the contrast with Walkerton here. So in this case, we had a situation where their whole setup for their source water was about as bad as it could be. So we actually had their municipal sewage outfall into the North Saskatchewan River upstream of their drinking water intake. This is not what you want, right? Like, you want it the other way around, right? It's you do not want to be having sewage flowing over your water intake. And in this case, remember I mentioned that that protozoan pathogen or parasite, well, this says parasite, Cryptosporidium. It is a pathogen. So Cryptosporidium is, remember, it lasts a long time in water, and you cannot kill it with chlorine. This is not something you want to have coming into your water treatment plant in large numbers, right? So again, it was proven that these actually came from that sewage plant, although cattle produce these too, so it could have been from that. But in this case, it was from the sewage. So in this case, about half of the town was made ill by this. It does take about a week for Cryptosporidium to show symptoms, so it was you had to wait a bit to actually see this. So there was another very strong, effective public inquiry of the system. So here's what this looks like. So you'll see the triangle that's a little bit was a little bit above and to the left. That's what is this labeled? That's the treated sewage discharge channel, and then a little further down the river, on the other end of that island, there's the surface water treatment plant intake. Now, apparently that intake had been the intake for a mental health institute earlier. So when the town was thinking about, okay, we need a new intake here, we need a new water plant, they'd said, well, let's save some money and let's go with that one because it's already there, right? That was probably a bad choice, right? And this is just a photograph of the same kind of thing, give you an idea. Now, someone had said, I don't know whether it was actually an engineer or something like that, so again, it could be one of those things where you can count on the information from experts. Oh, they said, oh, don't worry, because the sewage will all go down on the other side of that island, so you don't have to worry. But of course, that didn't happen like that. So the key events. In this case, there had been a long history of problems with the sewage plant. It wasn't properly treating the sewage. Made things even worse. You got that sewage plant upstream, and they weren't doing a good job treating the sewage. There had been a boil water advisory just the year before that I guess was resolved. And the other crucial thing here was the senior people that were running the water and sewage got so fed up with not getting support from both their most senior management and by council that they quit. So it left just inexperienced operators who were, unlike the previous case study, doing their best. They were working hard. They were messing some things up because there weren't good operating instructions for them to follow, that kind of thing. But they did a maintenance on a key piece of equipment, and that piece of equipment, if it had been working properly, would have removed most of the cryptosporidium. Because the only other thing they had beside that removal of that piece of equipment that they basically made non-functional was the chlorine. And of course, chlorine can't touch cryptosporidium. So again, this foreman retired after a stress leave because he just couldn't get the help that he needed. The water treatment plant, again, they just had really chlorine because of this improper repair by the junior staff that basically took away the removal function. Again, I don't think the blame, I don't think there actually was blame assigned to the junior staff that did this, because again, they were trying their best. So here's the disease pattern on this one. So you see it running along there. They're pretty confident that there was, again, this is epidemiological evidence, but they're pretty sure that they had these minor, very minor outbreaks of illness. So you're dealing here with a pretty difficult source water to start with, the North Saskatchewan River. And then again, they're adding in this sewage, so it's a tough thing. So the first little vertical dotted line there is the surface water treatment plant maintenance. So this is when they basically took out of service, accidentally in a way, the one process that would remove cryptosporidium. And you see after that a rapid increase in the rates of illness. And then finally, after many weeks, I think it was worked out to, the province put on a provincial drinking water advisory. And then after that, there was a gradual drop-off in illness, back down to the endemic level. And the other thing that was happening here was that piece of equipment that had been maintained, it was gradually, its ability to do particle removal was being restored. So the direct cause, again, is contamination. It went on for 6 weeks altogether. Operators did their best. Council, I guess the crucial thing for us was that council and senior management consistently rejected attempts at getting money for improvements to the system. So this one very directly speaks to the standard of care provisions. So North Battleford, source protection, there's a fail here. Again, the river itself and then the poor sewage treatment. Chlorine treatment, chlorination would not do it. This equipment repair, again, took out their treatment, so again, another fail on the treatment. Distribution storage wasn't a factor. Now monitoring, the operators may be able to do a better job of optimizing the treatment. And then management, so the big thing here was, again, the owners failed to provide sufficient resources. There was regulatory neglect. The place hadn't been inspected. There's some evidence that I think it was in the inquiry report, but the operators, when they were having difficulty with that piece of equipment that they'd maintained and then it wasn't working, they had called the province. They said, we got this piece of equipment, it doesn't seem to be working. Can you guys help us? And they were said, no, we can't help. There's nobody here to help you. The one guy maybe was on holiday or something like that. I've forgotten exactly what it was. But yeah, they said, no, the province couldn't help. So regulatory neglect and really lack of support for the operators. So again, there was this very long delay to getting the drinking water advisory out. Meanwhile, people, suffered through cryptosporidium. Cryptosporidium infection can kill immunocompromised people. There was a case in Milwaukee that caused, I think, about 50 deaths. But we might touch on that later. So again, this was another failure at all levels. Again, the real contrast here is the blame goes much more, I'd say, to the owners, because the operators were trying to do their best. Again, a little bit more, and this is one, that's why it's underlined, that's kind of just pokes you in the eye, that the council was sitting on a pile of cash. So it wasn't as if this was a town that was struggling, couldn't do anything because they just didn't have any money. They could have done it. And again, the provincial government was aware, and they hadn't inspected these facilities in 10 years. Again, they had inexperienced operators, so significant costs compared to the little bit of costs related to actually updating the water system. So, of course, you do something different if it was yours. Now, Flint, we won't spend a lot of time on Flint because it's a little different, but still topical. So with Flint, the big difference with Flint was that in the US, they have this system where if a town goes bankrupt, and it seems to happen like with startling regularity there compared to here, they kind of push elected council aside, and in place of that, they put in for all the decisions an emergency manager. So in this case, all of the bad decisions that were made were not made by elected councillors. They were made by this emergency, actually I think a succession of emergency managers. So it's kind of, and that might be on the test, by the way, that little nugget. I actually had one class where everyone got that wrong because apparently I hadn't emphasized that sufficiently. But and I try to keep up to date on some of these cases, and in this case, I saw a note that council, to their credit, actually had suggested, and we'll get to this, going back onto the Detroit City water supply. And that motion by council was rejected by the emergency manager as well. So what we had here, we had a situation where Flint was getting their water from the city of Detroit. It was good water, really good water. It came from Lake Huron, more or less. It had corrosion protection in it and was safe, like it was meeting all regulatory requirements, this water being sent to the consumers. So what this emergency manager did, they decided, oh well, it's way cheaper if we cut that supply and we start providing water from our own drinking water plant that's on the Flint River that was being used from time to time for emergency supplies. So what we had in this situation, so source was a big issue again. So in this case, we had this highly acidic water, aggressive water, from the Flint River, replacing this Great Lakes water with corrosion protection coming through. So it was interesting. In one of the sessions, one of the counselors had a piece of pipe from Walkerton with all of the deposits on the inside of the pipe. So similar here. And what happens? You put corrosive water through there, it eats away at all of that, and you end up just with a bare pipe eventually if the water is corrosive enough and aggressive enough. So it was a disaster waiting to happen. On the treatment side, water experts agreed that Flint River plant had to have corrosion protection added to it, and it had to have pH control, right? None of that was actually done. So there was inadequate treatment and ineffective operation. By reaming out all of those materials inside the pipes throughout the town, what you were doing, you were creating a good condition for the growth of Legionella bacteria. Now they grow in distribution systems and mainly plumbing. So what you're actually doing, all of a sudden, you're providing food for bacteria with all this material. And actually, this is where the deaths occurred. There were 12 deaths associated with this tragedy, all from Legionella, because we created these much more favorable conditions. So here's the plant supervisor saying it shouldn't be done. The distribution, again, that was a big part, right? So you had this aggressive water leaching lead from the system. A lot of the homes had lead service lines, and of course lead solder was pretty common too. It's a relatively poor town, so it hadn't been a lot of upgrades to a lot of the homes. Monitoring. Now this was one of the areas. Remember, I mentioned like in Walkerton, I was really shocked that the operators weren't testing for chlorine. Like if they had just done that, it would have been okay. I was shocked in North Battleford that the councillors had a pot of money and they were unwilling to spend it on their own community water supply, right? Of all things, right, to make that safer. So in this case, what we had were state government officials looking at information that was coming in related to Flint, and I had a chance to look at a bit of that myself. So I looked at a couple of streets, and when you look at the streets, you'd see all the addresses, and the first address, the lead was okay. The next address, the lead was okay. The next address, the lead was actually like way above like the standard. The next address, it was like crazily above the standard. And then it would go on, okay, crazily above the standard. Oh, just a bit above, a bit above. Okay, it was really irregular. Like it wasn't as if every single house was the same. Apparently, at the state level, someone decided that those ones that are crazily above, they must be like anomalies. So they didn't count those in terms of the averages. They actually arbitrarily made decisions that made the water look way less of a problem than it actually was. And that led them to state publicly that the water is safe. The water is safe. They kept saying it. They said it aggressively. Even though people were like from universities and that were going in, they were taking samples, analyzing the samples, coming up with these results. But of course, people weren't saying that's not authoritative, those results. So concluding thoughts on this one. Did I? Oh, okay. I think you got a page there on management, do you, in your book? For some reason I got a blank slide up here. But yeah, so all levels of this regulatory management failed. So we've got this Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, the Health Department, and the US EPA. And again, emergency management and managers made all the decisions. So all the barriers failed. And what we had here, we had these charges. One of those, the very first involuntary manslaughter charge, that actually carries a 15-year sentence, potentially. And one of the persons charged with that involuntary manslaughter was a director of the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. So he was one of these people that was saying everything's okay and covering things up. And again, people did die, right? These 12 people with Legionella. According to one source I saw, the state has already paid $3 million for the defense costs of that director. $3 million going into Flint would have done a world of good for the, for the town, right? In terms of replacing lead services, fixing things up, getting good communication, protecting the children. And so the task force had a look at this. So they actually, there's this, Flint Public Works' role in the crisis appears attributable to an inexperienced and poorly resourced organization. And then the next quote, the Ministry Department of Environmental Quality caused this crisis to happen. And then the whole business is about they communicated with a degree of intransigence and belligerence that has no place in government. And that's totally right? They just kept insisting that was right. And you know what it finally took for them to come around? Was blood tests of children. It had to go that far that you had to actually prove to them that the children of Flint had elevated levels of blood, levels that would affect their IQ for the rest of their life. That's what it had to get to before they finally smartened up and said, well, maybe there actually is a problem here. That was shocking. So the Canadian government the Canadian government puts out guidelines on water quality, so they have actually suggested a new guideline, a lower guideline. The province sets standards that they haven't changed yet. So Stratford. So with Stratford, I'll be very quick on this one because it's a good news story. So what we had here was a situation. Now this actually speaks to customer complaints. So a customer called in, said they had pink foamy water. Within minutes, they confirmed the customer actually had pink foamy water coming out of their taps and the toilet. And within minutes of that, they actually went to an adjacent car wash and shut it down. So somehow or other they knew that something was going on at this car wash. How did they know? They know because they were pretty sure, first of all, the house in question was right across from the car wash, and one of the staff on their way into work saw that there was a service truck at the car wash. So they were pretty sure, they put two and two together and came up with the right number, and whatever that is, and yeah, that was the issue. One of the positives out of this was that Stratford got to test their emergency plan. So they got out, every town, I'm sure you have a municipal emergency plan. So they got that out. They put their emergency control group together. They sorted out the problem. They set up alternative water supply, all that kind of thing. They did a drinking water advisory. Now, we talked earlier about boil water advisories. So there's two things. A boil water advisory goes out if there's a pathogenic issue, because boiling the water kills all pathogens, including cryptosporidium, everything. Right? Boiling kills all pathogens. A drinking water, however, it doesn't affect chemicals, right? In fact, it might even make chemicals worse, might make them more concentrated, whatever. So if there's a chemical contamination, what you typically see is a drinking water advisory where people advise, don't drink this water, don't use it for cooking, don't use it for some other purposes. So that came out from public health. That comes out from public health. And bottom line here, they spent a couple $100,000, and mostly in terms of staffing, and they solved this almost right away. So summary of analysis here. So source, no issue with their source water. Treatment was fine. They had the chlorination and treatment. Distribution and storage. So this is where they had the issue. So what they actually had here was they had a cross connection in this car wash, an illegal cross connection that directly connected the plumbing of the car wash with the plumbing, with the incoming municipal water supply. So this is what it looked like. So that, that braided plastic pipe was the illegal cross connection. And what we had was a pressure inside the car wash of 80 psi, and the city pressure was 65 psi. Now, with if you valved off the city water supply, you wouldn't have the backflow. But I guess for the servicing that was being done, they actually had the city supply, water supply on while the car wash was operational, and they got that backflow. So a crucial thing here is the bylaw, your backflow, your cross-connection backflow bylaw. So monitoring, again, what they weren't really tested too much, except for the person that took the customer complaint did a really good job of getting that dealt with. On the management side, again, these backflow devices, they're not regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. They're plumbing. They did have a backflow prevention bylaw, but of course, any kind of enforcement is very challenging. So there's a guidance document related to this. And then, so in terms of all the case studies, so the top one just talks about pathogens again. They're everywhere. Again, crypto's difficult to treat, as we know. And there's a mention here of the 1993 Milwaukee outbreak that we're going to touch on just a little bit later. And then complacency was a big factor. As I mentioned before, it's really easy to think that nothing will ever happen. Well, something could happen. Even in Stratford, I'm sure they thought, like, they've got super secure groundwater, excellent quality, never an issue. But they were on the ball when they actually had that problem. And of course, the cost of fixing these things up is dramatically higher than trying to save some money. So section 4, a little bit on what's next. So it's really kind of neat that you guys are seeing your operational plan tonight, because I think what you'll see and what you expect is that there is a culture of continuous improvement from your operating authority, as they actually have to. One of the things they have to do is they have to say, right, what you're doing for continuous improvement. So you'll see what they're saying there. That'll be good. There are challenges. And I know you have like 100 things at least on your docket, over the course of your several years as counselors. So it's really, kind of understanding. Okay, what are you going to be seeing over time? So this culture of prevention. Again, your staff are trained. What they're really looking for you is, I guess, to listen to them and so provide the resources to really meet those essential needs. So there's another. We touched on this, Milwaukee. Milwaukee, of course, is a city on the shore of Lake Michigan. It has excellent water quality available to it. They had 2 water plants. But they ended up with 400,000 cases of cryptosporidium. 400,000. It really shocked people in the water industry because most of us had never heard about cryptosporidium in 1993. However, there were people in the world that knew about cryptosporidium in 1993. And Waterloo actually had an outbreak of cryptosporidium as well. And there's been a number of other outbreaks. So another thing that I think can give you some comfort is the fact that the ministry actually does do an inspection of every one of your water plants every year and provides you with a report, a fairly detailed report, and a report card that includes, this list of things. So you get your annual report from your operating authority. You get this drinking water quality management standard to endorse, and you get the ministry inspection report as well every year. A little bit more on the inspection report. It includes a rating. So that's another kind of external report. Under the drinking water quality management system, that drinking water quality management system, again, you're seeing the operational plan tonight. Another thing that happens with that is the operating authority does an internal audit on that, but there's also an external audit of that system. So you'll have access to that external audit, or there'll be a reporting on the findings of that external audit as well. That's not done every year, but it is a frequent external audit. Training, so the operational staff, I already talked about the amount of training that they need. It's very a long process to get fully certified operators available. And of course, it takes years for people to get the experience they really need to do the job thoroughly. So it's a tough thing to retain staff and to move staff up through the system so they're able to take over as senior people retire. So a little bit here, what I really would suggest here, I think we've touched on all of these things, but the big thing is, communicate back and forth with the operating authority, ask them questions, be informed, and don't have to be an expert, but communicate. And when you make, important decisions about it, just make sure you retain and have at hand all of the documentation that you need to make those decisions. If you feel you're making a decision without adequate documentation, I would really suggest you ask for more documentation. I think that's important. So it's just these three things. That's the end of that. But we have a quick test, right? Everyone that wants a certificate out of this deal gets the test. Some councils I've been to take this as a technical exercise. One council where people were talking and
I think we should give it to everyone here that listened as well.
folks are done, so just a minute or two, I'll pick it up. Not a race, though. And actually, I think we still have a little, well, we're good on time, just. Okay, just in the interest of time, we'll do this. But again, we're going to take it up and together. So first of all, make sure you've got your name on the test. Everything else we can fill in. It should have said the best answer as opposed to the correct answer, because there's a couple where there's several correct answers, but there's one that's clearly the best answer. So I'm looking for the best answer. So number one. Mayors, councillors, and municipal officials with oversight responsibility need to be drinking water experts. True or false? False. Yeah, again, you can depend on experts, right? You don't have to be an expert yourself. You need to be, generally informed, but not an expert. Which of the following are generally perceived as the greatest threat to safe drinking water? Pathogenic organisms, byproducts of disinfection, mercury, or none of the above? Yeah, we must have said that lots of times, right? Pathogens, pathogens, pathogens. Who does the standard of care apply to under Section 19 of the Safe Drinking Water Act? Mayors, that sounds good. Councillors, sounds good. Municipal and corporate officials, maybe. And D is any person with decision-making responsibilities for a drinking water system. Yeah, D. And that's not including like operational decisions. It's really management decision-making, right? Number 4, which of the following is not directly a component of the multi-barrier approach to ensuring safe drinking water? Source protection, that sounds good. Effective treatment, that sounds good. Consumer surveys, I don't know, that's screwy maybe. And secure distribution, what did you get there? C, yeah, consumer surveys. They're useful maybe, but not part of the system. Given the circumstances that occurred in Walkerton, which of the following is true? The disease outbreak was not in any way the fault of the operators. The treatment process at the time was capable of dealing with the contamination. The public inquiry suggested failure at all levels. There was nothing that could have been done to prevent the outbreak. C, yes, that's the big one. B, they did have chlorinators on well 5, but they were overwhelmed by the contamination. And then later they actually switched to well 7. That had no chlorinator attached, so they really didn't have treatment that was able to deal with the process. 6, who made the financial decisions that led to the crisis in Flint? So that's the one that one group all got wrong, but I think you guys will get it right. Elected officials at Flint City Council, state-appointed emergency managers, the state governor's office, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. So that was the state-appointed emergency manager, yeah. 7, inspections of drinking water systems by the regulator, so that's the ministry, are useful because they can help identify problems, they can provide a report that can be used for guidance, they provide a comparison of past and current performance, or D, all of the above. Yeah. If you were an operator, you would have just written, right? If you see an all of the above, you almost always say that, right? Almost. Okay, number 8, pathogenic organisms are a widespread risk of causing waterborne disease because they cannot be treated by antibiotics or other medications. That doesn't seem to make sense. They're found virtually anywhere people or animals are found. That's good. They are all resistant to chlorine. Well, not bacteria, right? They cause disinfection byproducts, which pose a cancer risk. So what do you think? B, yeah, so they're found virtually anywhere people or animals are found. And then 9, reliance on source water protection as the sole barrier to drinking water contamination is an excellent idea because it's environmentally friendly, an excellent idea because it's cheap, a risky idea because there are practical limits to achieving low enough risk, a risky idea because recreational water users will object. So what do you think about that one? It would be cheap. C, it's a risky idea because it's good to have a good source, and maybe you can do something to improve the source, but yeah, you can't then not have treatment, for example. 10, why is it important to provide sufficient resources for operating a drinking water system? Drinking water is one of the most important services. That sounds good. Insufficient resources may signal a lack of concern to operational staff. That's probably true. Because it's required by regs, that's true. Or D, all of the above. D, all of the above. Okay, that's great. So I'll collect these, and if you've done the evaluation, I like the evaluations too. Thank you.
That's it. Thank you, sir. Okay, next we have 2 consent items that I guess are either being requested to be pulled for further discussion.